Hello, everybody. It's been a long time since I've spoken to Ryan. And in case a lot of you are wondering out there, sometimes us astrologers, we just use doing YouTube videos as an excuse to get together and hang out because otherwise we have our head in the computer in other ways, So in order to kind of, justify staying busy and hanging out, we just
Right.
make these little.
It makes our time a business expense.
Exactly, right, right.
Yeah.
I wanted to have Ryan on today because I wanted to talk about mythology and what the ethics of an astrologer are and what really an astrologer does, and equally how the client can help the astrologer to help the client
Mhm.
a little bit better, right? And I thought that would be a good thing for us to talk about today. And before we get into the mythology section, I had these two really wonderful quotes that I'm going to just kind of expand upon from Carl Jung, who was rich on symbolism, wrote a really wonderful book called Man and His Symbols.
Mhm.
And he was also very big on mythology. And these quotes kind of follow on one from the other, which is deriving from our remotest ancestors. There slumber in all of us subconscious memories which awaken at night and seek to compensate the false attitude modern man has towards nature. Let's reflect upon that a second. So what does he mean by modern man has towards nature? Well, that's nature as a whole, but it's also nature as a whole is what's in here. And have you ever noticed when you feel disconnected inside of yourself because you're kind of stuck in the humdrum 9 to 5 lifestyle, and then you get out in nature for like about 5 or 10 minutes, you feel like you're connecting with your soul? That's because that, at least my opinion, is that nature that's out there is reflecting the nature that's in you, and you're getting in touch with nature, and you're getting in touch with your nature. So compensate the false attitude modern man has towards nature. Myth is the primordial language natural to these psychic processes, and no intellectual formulation comes anywhere near richness and expressiveness of mythical imagery. Now, I wanted to talk about this today because, Vedic astrology is a system that is just so rich in mythological imagery, everywhere from, the nakshatras, which all have deities connected to them, to things like the Varga deities. Each particular Varga has, these deities connected to it. And the planets themselves are also deities. And so, Ryan, what do you think about all of these things?
Well, I think it's a very good point that you bring up. And I was just reminded of this a few days ago when I took a little stroll outside away from my computer to go get my mail. And it's winter here and trees are all off the leaves. It's fairly bleak. And as I was getting the mail, I heard some chirping and I started to listen. I realized that there were birds all around me. And I live on this kind of a hilltop, so I was looking out over the hill, and I was just paying attention to the birds, and it all came rushing back. I remembered being a little bit younger and spending a lot more time in nature, a lot more time simply staring off across, a valley, listening to the song of birds. And when that came to me, I recalled that when it comes to astrology, it's wonderful to look at a person's chart and it's wonderful to have your chart described to you. But one of the most fulfilling things you can do is actually to go outside at night and look and see that radiant Venus up there in the sky, or try to find Saturn and see it in regards to the backdrop of all the constellations, which, the constellations themselves, the way they're put together, the way we see them, the way we draw the lines between stars, all those are based on myth, stories, things that speak to a deeper level of our consciousness. So astrology is a wonderful thing in regards to the technique, the glyphs, the seeing it on the screen and sharing information. But my sense is that probably the most powerful aspect of astrology is getting us reconnected to the cycles and seasons within us, which often requires that we go outside and watch the sunrise or watch Mercury and Venus in the sky, or just sit and stare at the moon. I remember being in high school and just spending hours outside at night just watching the moon move through the sky. So nature, myth, astrology, all these things are tied together. So I'm glad you found those quotes. Those are fantastic.
Oh, most definitely. They're really wonderful quotes. And yes, I completely agree with you, because, whatever is out there,
Mhm.
we're only encountering it, I think, because it's in here too. It's inside of each of us.
Right.
So that's outside is equally being reflected inside. And I think, and I'm kind of jumping ahead of myself here too, but something you said kind of spurred a thought within me, which is I've often thought of an astrologer as being a time traveler, or helping the client to stop time for a moment, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if we think about how much we separate ourselves from our nature, how much we separate ourselves from nature, at large, and sometimes we need those moments where we have those little wake up calls. But we don't have to have those moments. We can take those moments ourselves and go and reconnect with nature. And there's a lot to learn from us doing so. And I think a lot of times when a client comes to an astrologer, what the astrologer can do is, whether they're looking at the past, or whether they're looking forward into the future for the individual, or really whether they're just helping them to look at the present moment, really what the astrologer is doing is stopping the clock for the person and reflecting back on all these different moments in time, right? So you can look at a person's past and understand where they've come from, why they are where they're at, how they're likely to go forward and carry things forward into the future. So being able to be outside in the world at large and go out and look at the night sky. And equally, and I know there's a mainly used in Prashna, there's a system of omens, right?
Right.
And the world at large just has all this really wonderful divinatory system for us as individuals. So sometimes when we're confused, just that moment of being outside in nature and you see a hawk, right? What do you think about? I think about, spark, the first beginnings of spring, beginnings, right? Or you happen to see a snake. You run really fast in the other direction. No,
Right.
just kidding. You think about change, or you see crows and you think about change. And really, there's such this rich symbolism that's inside of each of us that's reflected out there. But you were going to say something. I'm sorry. I get on a roll. I can't stop.
It's also very subjective, which is important to realize. You mentioned Prajna astrology, and Prajna astrology is simply astrology for the moment, and our birth chart is simply the astrology of the moment for our birth. And so all astrology is really the astrology of omens. The omens are what are the planets doing? We just happen to have a birth chart that allows us to see this. But when you mentioned, for example, the idea of the snake or the idea of the hawk, well, when I think of a snake, my initial reaction is not run away. I've always loved snakes. So for me, I'm thinking, well, can I pick this snake up? Or is it poisonous? Should I leave it alone? Or when I think of a hawk, a hawk has a specific meaning to me, as well as a crow does, also has a specific meaning. So what we also find is the subjectivity of the natural world, that if we have a question, that natural world, which is an aspect of ourselves that's not separate from ourselves, will speak to us in a certain way. Like when I see a crow, I love crows. I've always had a fascination with crows, always wanted to feed crows. And so when I have a question and I see a crow, and the more crows, the better, I have the sense that the answer to that question is positive. Whereas other people might see the crow and get the typical carrion bird, harbinger of death kind of thing, and think, oh, I had this question, I see this crow, so therefore it's bad. So the only point I wanted to make really was that I think we have to remember that what is most important is how we individually come to the representations in nature, or if we're using the idea of mythology, how we relate to those archetypes in mythology. And it's all based on our own understanding and feeling about those things that we perceive, because that external world, nature, or our mind, our consciousness, will reveal to us those things which will carry the right message or right information to us based on what we need to know at that moment. Does that make sense, what I was trying to share there?
No, completely. That sounds, very, right on spot with me. Every person has a different view on the universe. And as a matter of fact, it's interesting because this was something else I was considering talking about, which is I've had experiences in my consultations that I've done with clients where many times I'll see the little bit of advice that I need to offer them. And I'll start to kind of give that advice to them. And I get this resistance, right? And I'm going, wow, what's going on with that? And it kind of spurred me recently to go a little bit more towards looking at a Jaimini technique, which will show the Ishta Devata, but equally it gives you a glimpse at the moksha planet for the individual. Mm-hmm. And I found a lot of instances where, like if an individual has their moksha planet is Mars and you're trying to tell them, oh, well, just you need to kind of not push so forcefully or, surrender a little bit more, then you're kind of telling that person on a certain level to work against their will, right? And we all have these different perspectives from which we tune into things. And sometimes as an astrologer, it's a little bit complex. Mm-hmm. To pick up on that particular individual, right? We might miss this one minute little fraction. We're seeing this full scope vision on another level, but we miss one little planet and you have this whole thing, but back to the mythological. Yeah, everybody, to some people, that's why when people come to me and they say things like, well, I had a dream about this, that, or the other thing. What does it mean? Well, right. I always go, well, what does it mean to you?
Right.
Because sure, there's collective symbolism on many levels, but there's also, very personal symbolism. Mm-hmm. Like if, let's say, for instance, I'm just making this one up. My grandmother used to wear a rose water fragrance or something like that, right? And my grandmother was very kind and nurturing to me. Then when I smell roses, I'm going to have this really wonderful feeling, right?
Exactly, right.
But if somebody equally had an ancestor that wore rose, sorry, couldn't get that one out, and that ancestor used to, beat them or something,
right?
They're going to feel, repelled by that fragrance, And so we each have a different interpretation of symbolism.
Well, that's also one reason.
I'm sorry, just briefly. And then there's collective symbolism, which, astrology, especially Vedic astrology, with all the vast mythology that's wrapped up in it, has a lot of collective symbolism that really speaks personally to the individual. But there's also some certain things, and I actually have found with the Shastyamsha deities, if you play around with those a little bit, and you kind of understand the chart in relevance to those particular deities, you get some pretty profound things in relation to that. Right. I'm sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
That's okay. That kind of leads a little bit into the idea of the ethics of an astrologer in a few ways, and what does an astrologer do and how to work with an astrologer. Because on one hand, you're right, there's a collective symbolism, but there's also our individual symbolism. And the more often the better you know someone, the more often you work with an astrologer, the more they understand how you're going to react to certain things. So for example, I very much am into dreams. I love considering dreams, exploring dreams. But when I'm thinking about some dreams that are important to me, if I can't figure them out myself, I do want to go to someone and say, hey, what do you think about this? And I have had friends who in the past have done similar to what you have done and said, well, what does it mean to you? And I want to say, damn it, if I knew what it meant to me, I wouldn't have asked you.
Right.
But what I found is that, those certain friends, I have one friend in particular, a very good friend of mine, who knows me well enough that I can just simply say, here's my dream. I can't quite figure it out. What do you think about that? And he'll write me a long email or he'll describe it to me and not ask me what I think, because he knows me well enough that he can encourage me to consider certain things. And that's not telling me what it means. It's just saying, well, have you considered this? Which in turn gets me thinking about what it might be appropriate, what those things might be appropriate for me, the variables within the dream. And so developing rapport with an astrologer, or anyone really, can help them understand how you work with the mythology of your chart, the mythology of the planets, the energies and powers of the planets, nakshatras, and so on. But the other point that you brought up about talking to a client and not feeling like you should say a certain thing, or you felt a sense of resistance. I'm very familiar with that. And I remember reading an article one time. This elderly Indian astrologer, Indian man, he was about 80, I think, at the time. He was asked, what's the best technique you have, or you would advise people to practice and study in order to be a good astrologer? And he said one thing. He said, always tell the truth. And that sat with me for a bit. Always tell the truth. And then I became aware of the why that was so powerful and so potent, because like you're saying, if there's resistance, if you trust that and you don't follow it up, then you're eventually going to be lead to the thing which is the truth. Because once you can tell the truth and recognize the truth, then you know what to say based on what the chart indicates, what the chart represents. So, when I think about all these things, and I think about working with an astrologer, being able to tune in to understand how the client themselves functions, so you know how to speak to the own mythology of the chart, but also the astrologer himself tapping into the capacity to recognize truth, which is why things like meditation and practicing truth and so on are so important for an astrologer, because even with all the thousands of variables in a chart, if they can look at a chart and then speak to the client and feel out what is the appropriate thing to share with the individual, they're going to end up, serving the client a lot better, because they're doing their best to speak truth, but they're also trying to speak in such a way that is consistent with how the client themselves, how they know the client to be, if you will. Does that make sense?
It makes complete sense. When you said that, I was thinking, because I used to teach Kundalini yoga for years and years, which was brought to the West by a man named Yogi Bhajan. And something that he said about being a teacher, and the same thing applies to being an astrologer and being a good friend to somebody. I mean, because really, on a certain level, we're all teachers to each other. Is he said, a teacher is a forklift. Which the idea behind that is if you want to elevate somebody, you have to go in at the level that they're at, which isn't saying you're higher than them and they're lower than you, but you have to speak somebody's language. And so it is very important, I think, as an astrologer, to kind of understand what is the driving force behind this person. What language do they speak? If I'm doing a reading for somebody who has a lot of very predominant Scorpio energy, it's going to be very different than a reading I would do for somebody who has a lot of predominant, Taurian energy, for example.
Right.
Approach those readings very differently. If I was doing a reading for somebody that had a very strong Mars in their chart, it would be much different than somebody who had a very strong Venus in their chart. And you really have to know how to communicate to each person, and how they're, what symbols they understand, what language they understand. And it's a tricky thing, but it's very, very important to do. So I wanted to ask you, while, kind of leading on into the next topic, is if you had to define what an astrologer does, and then leading on into and I know we've been talking a little bit about this, but leading on a little bit into what the ethics of that astrologer doing those specific things should be, much like the yamas and niyamas of astrology, so to speak. How would you define that?
Well, that's a very good question. I think, depending on how we're going to go with this, it's going to depend on the astrologer. So on one hand, if I'm going to talk about how I approach it, my thought is that what an astrologer does, first and foremost, is simply share information. And I think that's an important delineation, because many people get into astrology thinking that they're going to transform people and change people's lives and do all these sorts of things. But people spend, many, many years studying things like psychology and counseling, or they go to theological seminaries and so on to address these sorts of things. And if an astrologer is trained as a counselor, or if astrologer is trained as a theologian, or if an astrologer has skills that can help a person heal and change their life, then I think it's okay for an astrologer to take on the role, the responsibility of being that kind of force of change. But if we're not, and if we're just doing our job as an astrologer, all we're really doing is sharing information. And it's the client's responsibility to take that information and do their best with it. And on that same level, an astrologer is also sharing trends, possibilities, things as they could potentially happen. And the reason I like to stress that point is because, we have the hype or whatever it is, that if you find a good astrologer, he'll be able to look deeply into your eyes or your soul and tell you exactly when you're going to get married and exactly what diseases you're going to have and so on. And I don't necessarily think that that's the case or true. I think sometimes it does happen, and I think sometimes astrologers can be exceedingly accurate, but it does a real disservice to clients to try to lay out, define a person's life path just by looking at a chart, because that chart itself is the snapshot of the moment they were born. That's the trajectory of their karma from the moment they're born. But it's not static. It's just like, Vic Dakar has a great little analogy where he talks about taking a baseball and throwing the baseball. The moment that baseball is released, well, that moment, that direction, the wind speed, the temperature, all these things, generally are going to tell you where that baseball is going to go. But maybe there's, the third baseman who's going to catch it, or, maybe something else, a bird is going to hit it. So we can see the trajectory of things, but after something is released, then there are other moments of time that come into play which can work upon that life situation. So my thought is, when it comes to an astrologer, their role first and foremost is to share information with the client, share trends, realizing that not even financial advisors, not even doctors, not even mechanics, not any of these professionals who've been trained for years and years and years have 100% accuracy in anything, but they can give you good advice about what to do based on what's the situation right now. Okay. And if an astrologer can do that, then I think that they're really doing their job. The worst thing I've seen astrologers do is get into astrology and act like they can say things like, just do this mantra and it'll all work out, or get this gemstone, or marry this person. And at the end of the day, you talk to these people and they'll say, my astrologer said this and it didn't work out. My husband's abusive. My child still had this sickness, whatever it might be. And that's a real disservice to clients. And even when it comes to things like remedial measures, there's all kinds of things we could talk about with remedial measures, but those remedial measures are not meant to be the cure-all magical wand that makes everything better. They're meant to focus your attention to redirect those moments of time so that you have a better likelihood of success, or a better likelihood of understanding what it's going to take to be successful. So, yeah, go ahead.
Exactly. But I mean, you're saying something there I kind of want to chime in on, which is in regards to remedies on a certain level, because I find as an astrologer, what I hear over and over again is, can you offer any remedies to help me to get married more quickly? Can you offer any
I know. I get them too.
Brush your teeth every day.
Yeah, right.
Or, what remedies can you suggest to make me a millionaire? And I had this one really big horror story that one client came to me with, which was, I had been to an astrologer and they made me really afraid of going to see an astrologer, because what they did was they said I had some curse in my chart, but that if I bought this ruby from them, it would eliminate that curse from my chart. Well, that just kind of brings to mind the whole P.T. Barnum quote, which is, there's a, sucker born every minute, Right. It's really sad, because really what I like to tell clients is remedies are there to help you to harmonize with your karma. They're not there to, make it disappear for you.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to make it disappear, then in my opinion, I think you're kind of avoiding prosperity in general.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's something that you stand to gain from those challenges. There's something you stand to gain from those difficulties. Go ahead.
Just that whole idea of difficulties and problems and so on. I mean, I'm thinking of I've had the really great fortune of speaking with a lot of astrologers recently, doing interviews like this. And so it's great that we're getting to talk about this. Like I did a session with Dr. Arjun Pai. And he was talking about remedies and the best way to use remedies. And another woman I was talking with, Joyce Levine, who's the president of the NCGR, she was talking about things like Saturn and suffering. And, I think what we always forget is that the remedies are there, like you said, to help harmonize us. But they're not necessarily there to make things disappear in the same way that we can't make Saturn disappear. And what I have found, one of my personal feelings, the greatest blessings I've ever had, has been some fairly tremendous suffering that I've experienced in my life. Because what did it do? It humbled me. It made me appreciate the fact that I have a warm place to live and good food. It made me appreciate the simple things in life. And then I became much happier. And so when you talk about getting rid of problems, I think there are certain things we should try to avoid. Like, for example, don't go out and run up all kinds of credit card debts. That's like a stupid thing. Okay. But there are certain things in life. There are certain things in life that you cannot help. And so when we have problems, the question needs to be, is this something that's more of a growth experience in a way like what you're describing? Or is this a stupid problem that, yes, a remedy might be, let's just get some more education about it? Do you understand the difference I'm trying to?
Yeah, no, I know exactly what you mean, and kind of following on with that a little bit. So let me make up an example, right? Let's see if I can come up with a good one. You tend to get in all these relationships that don't work out for you because you completely surrender the entire person that you are to the other individual, and you don't have clear boundaries with the person. Well, what's the smartest decision in that scenario? Is the smartest decision to, wear like a stone for Venus, or to chant a Venus mantra, or, anything else in that regard? Or is it to kind of go, I need to establish clearer boundaries for myself, relationships?
Well, that's a very important point, and I'm on both sides of that, in the sense that, number one, I wholeheartedly agree with the idea that if you've got relationship problems and that's the issue, which you can see in the chart, a gemstone, a mantra, and so on is not the answer. The answer is try to develop better boundaries, which is hard, and no one wants to do that because it's hard. And I have a real love for Jiddu Krishnamurti, and the reason I like his approach so much. I know he's controversial in many ways, but one of the things I really appreciate about him is his whole philosophy is about pay attention to what's actually really going on, right? So if you have a problem and you have sadness or you have boundary issues, is the problem that your Venus is really messed up, or you've got Mercury and Sun together, or is the problem that you have not dealt with in real time actually having boundary issues? Like one client, she was having difficulty at work, and she was sort of being mistreated by men, not like harassment or anything, but she's really well educated, and she would often be treated like a secretary when she often has better qualifications and degrees than these other individuals. And so what she wants to do is to rise more fully in her career. And so what does she need to do there? She needs to act more in a way that kind of commands respect. And the clearest example, I was talking to her, she said that she went to talk to the person who's in charge of her financial, like, retirement savings. And she has a very good advisor who does very well for her. And so she was just saying, look, I need to know where to find this information so my advisor can help me. And this man who was talking down to her was saying things like, yeah, but have you thought about this? Is he teaching you things like this? And she went back a little bit and started to kind of like take that, the non-dominant role and sort of answer the questions when it was none of his business, right? It was absolutely none of his business. All she needed to know was where to go on the website. But she kind of gave into that typical role where she would get a little tread upon. And so when she said that to me, I said, look, if your goal is to gain greater respect and to let people know where you stand, the response you should have given to him was, it's none of your business. And then that's it. Because that's what a man would have done. Right? If someone would have said that to me, I would have said, F off. It's none of your business. I've got my advisor, so just be quiet. So in that situation, she thanked me and she said, that's great. I understand now. That makes perfect sense. And it's those kinds of things that a lot of people don't want to do. But one more thing to go along with that, with the mantras and gemstones and so on, I still like to recommend those not as a magical formula, but as a focal point, as a reminder to empower the process. Meaning, if someone has a weak Mars, like this individual, and she has a hard time standing up for herself, I will say, do Mars mantras or get a Martian gemstone. And every time you say that mantra, and every time you look at that gemstone, remind yourself of the qualities and the energies that you are working to embody and manifest. And in that regard, not only does the vibration of the mantra help, but it's also a reminder to every day, if she's in another situation like that, maybe she'll happen to glance at the Martian gemstone and then tell the guy, it's none of your business. And then you see what I'm saying?
No, I completely agree. And I tend to use them in the same exact manner, really more on a case-by-case basis.
Right. For sure. Mm-hmm.
So if I see somebody that's got too much attachment, it depends on the case with this too. If I see somebody who's got too much attachment to remedies, right, and they're going to not do the work themselves,
right.
Probably going to, if they're still really desiring a remedy, I would probably be, going, this person needs to do some sort of service or seva,
mm-hmm. so
that they're doing an action,
right,
rather than relying upon something else to do it. But then on other instances, I often, when I do recommend remedies to people, it is more on the basis of, this is to harmonize
mm-hmm.
you with
mm-hmm.
it. This is really just to connect you to something that you're perhaps needing a little bit of help with because you're having a hard time focusing your awareness on it. But it's not to miraculously burn all your karma away, which quite often I tend to get people who have that particular viewpoint on remedies, that those remedies are going to eliminate all of their karma for them. Because there are actually a lot of astrologers out there who will say certain things like that to the clients. I've actually had that reflected to me, that I was told if I did this, that it would burn the karma of this away.
Mm-hmm.
And nothing is going to burn that karma away until that karma is ready to be burned away, because that's God's influence on it. I mean, this is, I'm going to say it here because it's on my channel. I'm being like an asshole, because assholes and everybody has one.
Right.
So I'm kind of voicing mine in this particular instance, which is, God is everywhere. The universe is everywhere, whatever it is you want to call it. So when that karma is ripe and ready to be resolved, mm-hmm. then it will naturally happen. Whether it's happening by you going, wow, I'm really going to focus my attention on it. It's happening because you're ready to focus your attention on it. Whereas previously you might not have been ready to. But, back to what we were just discussing, it really has to be on a case-by-case basis. But in terms of the do's and don'ts of an astrologer, I think that, to have a blanket approach to something, for me, that's a very big, I think do's and don'ts are, kind of per astrologer too, but that's a very big one, which is to kind of take it on a case-by-case basis. It's going to be.
That's why I mentioned, right when we got into this particular section, that it does depend on who the astrologer is. Like, for example, when I first got into Vedic astrology, I was exactly that way. I was gung-ho about, do this mantra, get that gemstone, it'll work out beautifully. I thought it worked. I did it for myself. And, it's been experience that through time has taught me what we're discussing here today. And, we do have to remember that not everyone understands things in the same kind of fashion. And so there may be an adamant astrologer out there who just says, if you just do the mantra perfectly right, if you just intonate it perfectly, it'll all work out great. And there's nothing you can really say that'll change that person's opinion.
Right.
Because astrology is a lot like religion.
Exactly.
I mean, it's totally like religion. That's one thing that, in a sense, I have a lot of difficulty with astrology, is that all we're doing in astrology often is just trading out our, for us in the West, our Catholicism of go to confession and do so many Hail Marys, in exchange for go pay the priest to do a puja and do all your mantras. It's the same thing. It's human nature of taking the easy way out.
Exactly.
And typically what happens is everything changes, which means that sometimes you'll find, and astrologers use this, I'm sure, especially the ones who know the astrological chart and how to forecast well, they'll say things like, just do this mantra for 6 months, because they know in 6 months that thing's not going to be a problem anyway.
Right. Of course. Yeah.
Yeah. And everything goes up and everything goes down. That's just the nature of life. Right. But
exactly.
One final thing I would like to say on this point before we get a little more into ethics is that my personal opinion about all these things is that in order to benefit from astrology, you don't really need an astrological chart. All you need is to understand the higher nature of every planet and live to embody that planet. So, for example, if we understand that Mars isn't really about picking fights, but Mars is about fighting the good fight that's appropriate. Mars is about fixing problems when there's actually a problem, not making more problems, about being logical. Well, if someone has a problem with Mars in their chart, whether they do or they don't, if everyone would live and strive to manifest the higher principles of Mars, they wouldn't need astrology. If everyone would strive to manifest the higher principles of Venus or the higher principles of Saturn, they wouldn't care about these things. So on a mythic or archetypal level, really astrology serves as a, a blueprint. Just by understanding the planets and their energies and their powers, it serves as a blueprint to help people live in such a way that they don't really need astrology. Does this make sense?
I'm going to pause there for a second. Is it jerking any on your end?
It wasn't, no.
Right. Well, what we're going to do, if it's okay with you, is I may have you upload the recording afterward.
Okay. Yeah,
I'll rely on yours. Okay.
Was I jerking?
You are on my end, but it's just my connection. So if your recording will probably be better.
Okay.
Do you see what I'm saying? If it's not doing it on your end, you're
then
recording.
Then you can just cut it and yeah. Okay.
You ready?
Yep.
No, that completely makes sense. And while you were talking on that, and you were speaking of the, the highest energy of each planet, and you were bringing up the concept of astrology being somewhat like religion, which is, if you are the type of person who is predisposed to religion, then really on many levels, Vedic astrology is going to be perfect for you, because the planets each have a mythological connection.
Exactly.
Right. And so if you're going to tune into the highest nature of a planet, you can also tune into the highest nature of deities that would be somewhat connected to that planet. Let's say, for instance, Mars, as you were talking about, well, Kartikeya or Skanda, connecting to that higher nature, right? It depends on your own personal mythology, so to speak. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So I kind of wanted to shift on to the ethics.
Okay.
Yeah. So
I can talk all day on that. So
go for it.
Well, where would you like to start? Because in my mind, there's all different ideas. Like, for example, when a client writes to me and they say, "I want you to do a chart for my 38-year-old son," do you do it? Or do you know what I mean? Like, where would you like to start with that?
Yeah, well, you know what? That's a really good one to start on.
Okay.
Because, I've had some instances like that are very similar.
Yeah.
Where I've gotten the feeling that somebody is hiring me as the astrologer to be their own personal spy or detective. Right. And in those instances for myself, I just go, no,
Right.
I'm not doing that because I don't have that person's permission to look at their chart. But anyway, what's your take on that? I would love to hear.
Yeah, well, when I was younger, I didn't really think too much about it. Well, because I was younger and I was just stupid. But the more I practiced, the more I started to realize, you know what? If I love doing the charts for children, newborns, young children, I love doing it because it allows me, at least in my mind, to help a parent understand how to interact with their child. So I totally get that. And I love, love, love doing that. And I seem to do pretty well at it from what I've been told. But, I get a lot of people saying, my 22-year-old daughter or my 38-year-old son, I'd love you to do their chart for me. I said, do they know that you want them to do it?
Right.
And so my ethics around that now is when people write me in that way, I say, I'm happy to do a chart for your child if they contact me and they say, I want you to do the chart for me. If you want to pay for it, I've got no problem with that. But for an adult, and I don't even do gift certificates anymore for people, because someone will say, I want to get this gift certificate for someone. I'll say, look, if they really want an astrology session, have them contact me. And if you want to pay for it, that's totally fine. But if they're 18 or older, I don't do that anymore. It seems a little bit like prying. And the funny thing is you can learn real quick who the parents are that want you to pry. And we have to be careful with that too, because there's also a cultural difference, meaning
exactly,
like, for example, it could be that you've got the matriarch or patriarch of the family, and they feel that it is their role and their mission to take care of everyone. And so if they have that inside information, that will help. So there is that cultural difference and that even generational difference. But my idea is that if you're over 18, you have to contact me directly. I'm not going to do it because your parents want me to do it, or because your wife wants me to do it. I get that too. Can you do a chart for my husband? I say, does your husband want an astrology session? No, but I just want to understand him better. I said, have him write to me. If he's okay with that, if he wants me to do that, I will more than happily oblige. But if not, I don't do those kinds of things. And that's the reason, is because it feels, like you said, like prime.
Exactly. And I'm glad you brought up the thing, while we're on the subject, because you did bring it up, of doing readings for children. Uh-huh. And this is another ethical thing too. And this is somewhere where I think astrology can really, really, really help.
Okay.
And, children that are younger, which is understanding where that child is.
Right.
Because quite often, I've encountered a lot of people who will have children who are labeled as ADD or something like that. And you'll look at that chart and you're just seeing this amazingly creative individual who is just vastly different than anybody else that they're going to interact with.
Right.
And it's not that there's anything wrong with that child, per se. Quite often it's just what's the best way to phrase this? A disconnect, which may be beyond the parent's control, between the chart of the child and the chart of the client. Because myself, as a parent and an astrologer, one thing I've come to know very deeply is no matter how much you might want to step in there and remove that karmic path from that child,
right,
you can't do it. And the more you try to do it, the more you'll just end up tripping over your own feet in most instances and getting away. Yeah. But by the same token, to understand where that child is coming from, their perspective on the world, it's completely invaluable. On the other subject of what point do you draw the line? I completely agree with that. And it is, it is very much a cultural thing too.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Because there are some instances where you just know that parent does, in many instances, have the permission of the child.
Right.
And you do find out, and you're kind of confirmed with that. But I completely agree with it. If the person is over a certain age, you want to have their permission, because otherwise you're going into something that you don't really have their permission.
Right.
To go into.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And with children, people will ask me to do the charts for children, and what you mentioned, it helps them to understand where their child is coming from. But the other thing, it can also help a parent and a child to see how they're going to relate to each other based on how the chart is set up. Because it might be that they're not going to have that lovey-dovey, fantastic bond that they would expect, because maybe in this lifetime, that distance needs to be there, right? Or maybe, you know, the child needs a little more discipline and doesn't need to be coddled, or vice versa, and so on. The other thing with children is, oftentimes parents write to me and say, tell me when there's going to be times of sickness and, you know, all these kinds of things. And I don't get into that either.
No, neither will I.
I'll mention things like, this could be a difficult time and you need to maybe readjust what they're doing in life for this. But I don't get into, you know, they're going to have a serious infection and die at this time. Because number one, if that's their karma, whether I tell them or not, it's not going to change anything.
Right.
But when I do sessions for young children, like babies, young children, I spend time focusing on the possible strengths, the possible weaknesses, how they're going to relate to the people around them, how they'll best be educated, the things they'll be interested in. Because, for example, when I was growing up, if my parents would have been into astrology, the astrologer would have told them, you're going to have a weird child who has no interest in football or motorcycles, even though you want them to ride motorcycles and play football. And then maybe there would have been, you know, a little bit different interaction, and maybe not, who can say? But I think those are things important astrologically to have that kind of description of a child's chart to a parent for clear upbringing, maybe.
Yeah, well, I kind of want, I'm tempted to ask this. Yeah. It's a bit of a digression from the ethics thing, but maybe not.
Okay.
So on that point of parent-child, you look at a child and you see that child has Rahu conjunct the sun in the chart.
Okay.
The parent is asking, what is this child going to do for a living? I want to know that they're going to grow up and be really, really, really successful and make lots of money in life. What are you going to tell that parent?
With Rahu's sun?
With Rahu's sun.
Well, I would say it's highly likely, because I actually know quite a few people with Rahu's sun that are doing very well financially. I would focus more on the fact that this person's going to be possibly an overcompensating, aggressive child. And not that that's a bad thing, but I would say that they're learning to develop their masculinity in a healthy fashion. And I would say that they're learning to believe in themselves without over exaggeration, right? And if you tell a parent that about Rahu's sun when the child's growing up, that parent can talk to people, whatnot, who know about these things to help encourage that child in such a way to where they don't become kind of like a egomaniac, which is it's common with Rahu's sun. It's not always the way it works out, but it's a common factor, you know, because the person doesn't necessarily know how to believe in themselves, so they they try too hard, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And so if a parent knows that, then they can work with the kid and say, hey, look, you know, you don't have to push so hard. We love you anyway. This is how you be a man in such a way that's, you know, healthy-minded. And they can say, oh, okay, I get that, because Rahu is about developing that sun. So, the trouble is when it's left undeveloped and then they're already an adult, and now you have to try to tell the adult, hey, back off a little bit. And they're like, what do you mean back off a little bit? But I don't know. Did I take that in the way that you meant?
No, definitely. I mean, you did on some levels. There was one more thing I kind of wanted to expand upon from what you said, which is, you know, so yeah, you help them to know that they're loved no matter what.
Exactly. Yes.
What I have found if I had to put a percentage on it, which I'm never big on percentages. As a matter of fact, I digress for a second. You know, when people, you know, want to know accuracies that astrologers can have, I will quite often go, well, an astrologer can be 100% accurate 70% of the time.
Right. Yes.
Because that's a true expression, you know, if they're a good astrologer. But on the other note, I've found a predominance of situations where when the child has a Rahu-Sun connection, quite often at an early age, there's this ideal of who they should be.
Right, exactly, yes.
On them. I'll give you an example. I knew a particular instance, not astrologically over here, just through, you know, personal interaction, of a parent that used to wake their child up at 5 a.m. in the morning, make them do tennis practice, make them do swimming practice before they went off to school, because they wanted them to grow up to be yeah, this successful, well,
Yeah.
those children many times grow up to not know who they are.
Right. Right.
Who am I? I've had this identity forced upon me at an early age. Now I don't have that identity forced upon me. And what am I going to do?
Well, and that's a very important point about Rahu's sun is the identity issue, because oftentimes a person will grab an identity and so forcefully hang on to it, not because it's really what they're up to. Actually, I was thinking about someone's chart that I was working with earlier today. They had a very similar issue, and they're extremely successful. They do very well, but everyone thinks that they're in the right place. But they have this deep nagging doubt about how did I get here and why am I doing this sort of thing?
Right. Exactly.
And that's the difficulty, but that's Rahu's sun. That's the person trying to figure out who they are, the sun, which is Rahu, the confusion.
Yeah.
Right. And so it can go in an extreme fashion. But if a parent knows that about a child, that's good. But the trouble with that is usually the parent will often have a karma or an indication where there might also be some confusion. And so they're actually forcing or projecting that problem that they have onto their kid. Do you know what I mean?
I know exactly what you mean. And quite often when I get in those situations, I'll go to the Dwadashamsha chart and try to see, what's really going back there.
Yeah. Yeah.
For several generations. Yeah.
I mean, the Rahu Sun thing, we could spend probably days just talking about that itself, but those are just some general.
Maybe we should do that sometime. That would be a good thing to talk about because it's specific Rahu connections in general. For somebody to do a video on. So if you're an astrologer, you can steal our idea out there because it's
right. Exactly. Yeah.
So so we've spoken about on many levels, even though I know we could continue to go on and on with this, what is right by an astrologer. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm tempted to say, but I'm going to rephrase it. I'm tempted to say, what is the right approach for a client? But it's maybe each client is a different individual and we have to understand that. But it's probably better to phrase that in terms of how can a client get the most out of their consultation with you? I'll speak on, my own particular things with that too, but I'm feeling we'd be in agreement on a lot of points with that.
Yeah. So I do approach that in a particular fashion. And when I start out all of my sessions, anyone who's ever gotten a session with me, anyone who's gotten multiple sessions with me, they can probably recite what I say at the very beginning. And essentially what I do some mantras to Ganesh, the Lord of Obstacles and the Remover of Obstacles. And I do that with the intention that the right and proper information for this individual be revealed through the work together. I do the mantra again. Then I say, I intend that the client, the individual, has the capacity to sit with and contemplate what is shared based on their particular life experience and what they understand about themselves. And I do the mantra again, then I intend that the information that is shared helps to lead them to greater fulfillment. Okay. And that middle one, that's the most important, because I think a lot of people put all the responsibility on the astrologer. And the astrological reading is not just the astrologer reading a person's chart. It's the astrologer sharing what they see, and then the client sitting with, contemplating, thinking about, figuring out in their own mind, in their own consciousness, okay, how does this actually apply to me? Because I'm 48 years old, and I've lived my life into this point, and I know that what he said here, I've already gone through, and I've already dealt with. I know what he said here. My wife says it's true, but I don't believe it. I know what he said here is absolutely not accurate. And so when a client can approach it from that point of view, they're taking on their own responsibility. And we know that saying, God helps those who help themselves. And they're not trying to have someone tell them what to do, because the moment you want the astrologer to tell you what to do, you're authentically getting rid of the free will that God gave you. You're getting rid of the responsibility that God gave you to live this life, to live this adventure. And you're just saying, it doesn't matter. I'm doing whatever the astrologer said. If it works out, I'll say that's great. If it doesn't work out, it's his fault. So
Bingo.
anyway, the point that I try to get out in all of my sessions is that this is about me looking at your chart, doing my utmost best with the knowledge I have, with the intuition I have, to share what I see as I can interpret it to be helpful for you. But the other side of that equation, the other 50% of that equation is, what are you going to do with it after this point? And then they go out into their life and they live, and they write back and they say, when should I have a follow-up session? I say, give it 6 months, give it a year, take some time, apply what you have learned, and then come back with how it worked. Like, when you applied these things, what was your experience? And then we can talk about it some more. We can develop better rapport, and we can continue on developing that kind of relationship. And you're developing your capacity for responsibility, and to live this adventure that God gave you to live, right? So does that answer your question?
Oh, completely. And you touched on a very important point there, which brought up the concept of cutting the cord, which is, sometimes I have found as an astrologer that you do get these people who are too reliant. They're too reliant on the astrologer, and astrology, in my humble opinion, is a way of understanding ourselves. It's the highest form of yoga, in my opinion, that we have. You can understand yourself, and you can understand yourself to the nth capacity. But again, it's not about abrogating the responsibility to that client. And I like what I know Ernst did a video once where he had as the image for the video, zombies. Are you the type of person who's, going to walk through life as a zombie?
Yeah.
Living your life by what astrology says you should do? Or are you going to engage with the world? And if you take that information from the astrological session, are you going to work with it? And there comes a point, and I've had to do it a few times, where you get people who are too attached, and they come back over and over again, even come back over and over again and ask the same question.
Right. Yes.
If they asked you 2 or 3 times already.
Yeah. I'm going into my 8th house period. What's going to happen? Well, I told you 3 months ago, re-listen to it.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
And it ends up reaching a situation with those where you go, you know what, you're too attached to it, and it's not just you waiting to see how it's going to happen. It's also you interacting with your karma. And in addition to that, I'm a big fan of, if I'm saying something to a client, and, as you mentioned, sharing information with them and sharing the truth, I'm a big fan of going, but you know what? Prove the astrologer wrong.
Yeah.
You know what? Because I'm not God.
Right.
I can only tell you what I am given permission to access at this particular moment in time. And sometimes there's a reason why I can't access those things, right? Sometimes that reason is I've had no sleep at all for several days in a row. I'm a human being. Sometimes that reason is God doesn't want you to hear it.
Well, one quick thing, or there's a few things that came to mind, but one thing I want to make sure to interject is what you mentioned, that, we don't know everything.
No.
And too often we're fed this advertising or slogan or propaganda or rhetoric or whatever it is, that if you just learn astrology perfectly, you will know everything. And one thing that I teach my students in the apprenticeship course, we just finished the first year of it, and what I tried to drill in their head was that when you're looking at a person's chart, if they ask you a question about something and you can't see confluence that says yes, no, or otherwise, you need to have the courage to say, I don't know. I can't see it. Yeah. It's not there, because that's
I'm not able to access it. Yeah.
Exactly. And that's going back to the idea of telling the truth, because on one hand, there's a few things. Maybe it's not appropriate for that information to be shared for them because it'll detract them from their path. Number 2, maybe the chart is so chaotic that there's just no confluence there. It just doesn't show that, and what I found is that when an astrologer can say, here's what I can see clearly, and it's this, A and B, and these other things you asked me about, I really have no idea. I looked at the chart, I've accessed it, I've done all the research, and it's just not clear. When an astrologer can do that, those things they can tell you about A and B are going to be pretty accurate.
Yeah.
Versus going and making up C for,
Yes.
Just because there's the expectation that the astrologer should know everything. So one thing that I have found in astrology, that when an astrologer has done their research, they've learned astrology well, they've done their best, they've meditated on it, at the end of the day, there's still no answer. They have to be able to say, I don't know, and move on. Because then when they do know something, they will really know it. Like it'll be clear. Like one woman I worked with, I teach Ayurvedic astrology at the Asheville School of Massage and Yoga here in Asheville. And I did a session for one of the students there because they have to get sessions with the teachers. And there was a pretty serious health issue in there. And I saw it, and I'm not one to be alarmist, but I said, look, this is serious. It showed up 5 out of 7 times. During this period of time, you have to pay attention to these things. And she was very concerned. She wrote back and she said, I know you're not typically an alarmist. Why are you saying this? I said, because from my experience, when I see something pointing in that direction that many times, you got to pay attention to it. And sure enough, it became an issue for them. But since they knew in advance, they were able to deal with it before it became a serious life-threatening thing.
Yeah.
But other people will ask me things about health, and I'll look, and there's just no confluence. It's average. There's nothing serious. There's nothing, it doesn't go one way or the other. So that's the point that I'm trying to get at, is by telling the truth about knowing when to say, I don't know, will make you a heck of a lot more accurate when it's very clear, Mm-hmm. And I think an astrologer who can understand that and not take on the role of God like people think they should be, they'll be a much better astrologer at the end of the day.
Exactly. I completely agree. I completely agree with you. Yeah. So, I would say, just kind of summarizing my point of view from my end, I think things that I didn't cover in this session that I'd like to kind of cover here at the end in terms of the client's approach is how you phrase your question. I find that is a really big one. And I know we're kind of getting a little bit off of the really deep stuff and more into something concrete, but
right.
I find quite often I get these really broad questions. I want to know about relationships. Well, what do you want?
Yeah, what do you want to know? You're terrible at them. Okay, there.
Exactly. I can either look for a needle on a farm, or I can look for a needle in a haystack. Which would you rather have me do?
Right.
I'd rather narrow it to looking for a needle in a haystack in my own, if I had the opportunity. I'm convinced, and this isn't me, so I hope nobody misunderstands me, because I'm not intending to diss other astrologers, but from the experience that I have with clients who come to me, I'm convinced that there are astrologers who are out there who are just taking a quick 2-second glance at a chart and guessing.
Right. Yeah.
And I feel that there's so much more of a responsibility that the astrologer has to a client, because quite often I get these people who they're supposed to have 4 questions. And in their first question alone, there's 20 questions.
Right.
And what they don't understand is that with each of those questions that they're actually asking me, I'm going to be looking at them in at least 3 or 4 different ways. I'm not just going to go, right, I'm just taking a quick glance at your Vimshottari dasha and taking a guess.
Right.
Because I don't want to tell you something that I much like you said, that I don't know.
Yeah.
And if I don't know, I don't have any problem telling you that I don't know either. Right. But by the same token, I'm going to try to find out for you, and I'm going to try to be as certain as I possibly can. And even then, I could completely be wrong.
Right. Well, you bring up a good point about the, tell me about my relationships. Okay. Well, tell you about your relationships when you were 18, tell you about your relationships now,
right.
These sorts of things. So what I like to do is in my intake form, I specifically state, ask your question in such a way. I say, please state your question, and then give any details you might feel is pertinent to help me understand what you're really asking.
Yeah.
Right. One woman recently asked me, tell me when is a good marriage time. And so I went and I looked through the chart. I went and looked through a 30-year period, and I found a 9-month window. And I thought, out of 30 years, that's a pretty good window. And she wrote back and she said, I thought that astrologers were supposed to be better at like pinpointing the actual day. I said, sometimes we can do that and we can do it beautifully if the chart has that so clearly indicated. Like the person has Mercury and Venus in the 7th house, one of them's in its own sign, the Navamsha is getting activated at the same moment. Sure, we can say within this week period of time, probably going to happen. But when there's not that, when it's more general, more broad, picking a 9-month window of time, I think that's pretty close myself. I mean, maybe I'm just a poor astrologer and that's possible. But what you're talking about, when a person can get more specific about what are you asking, then the astrologer can get more specific. So someone says, tell me about my relationships. I see Rahu, Saturn, and Mars in the 7th house. And if it's that simple, I say your relationships are terrible. Right. I mean, that's a joke and an overgeneralization. But, if someone says, tell me what's getting in the way of my relationships and my capacity to relate to my husband. Well, now I know you're married. Now I know you're trying. Now I can look at Mars and Rahu and Saturn and see what they're set up like, and then speak to what do you need to do to improve those things based on all those planets. So the specificity is very important as you're
Exactly. And if somebody, asks you the question, tell me about my life. Well, what you do is you go, I see you getting up in the morning. You're getting out of bed. You're walking across the room. Right? You're having breakfast.
Well,
I've been the most accurate astrologer in the world.
And that's a good point. And let's think about career and so on. Ernst brought up this good point. I was talking to him a little while back. He said, of course it was easy to predict who you're going to marry and what you're going to do for work, 100 years ago. If you happen to be a lumberjack, well, your daughter is going to marry the guy that makes chairs from your wood. Right. If your son is born to you and your dad's a lumberjack, more than likely you're probably going to be a lumberjack. So when we think about it, we're at a point in time where, thousands of different jobs are created every day. Well, that's maybe an exaggeration, but a lot of different jobs are created every day. So when it comes to things like career, an astrologer using what we know from these older texts, they can get in the ballpark. But if the client writes and says, hey, look, I'm considering, to be a neuroscientist, a farmer, an advertiser, or a baseball player. All right, well, now the astrologer can go and look at the chart and say, here are the skill sets that would lead you to greater success in maybe this particular field of these 4 that you're thinking about. So, that's, I think, very important because, for example, all my life, my family told me I should be a psychologist. Ever since I was a little kid, they're like, you should be a psychologist, right? And so I went to school for psychology. Am I a psychologist? Not really. My grandmother always used to say, Ryan, you should work with computers. She would always say that. Wonderful. You do wonderful with computers. And so if an astrologer would have said that to me, looking at my chart, the guy's going to be a psychologist, the guy's going to work with computers. Would he have been too far off based on what I actually do for a living?
Right, exactly.
No, I'm an astrologer, which does a lot of psychological things. I'm on computers all day long. So you see, when we think about these things, there's so much there's so much subtlety in the way you can ask questions or the things you're going to end up doing that an astrologer might get very right. The guy's going to be a psychologist. He's going to work with computers. He turns out being an astrologer who's on his computer all day long. Yeah. You can see where it overlaps.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Good point. So Ryan, I could just talk for
I'm sure. Yeah, me too. But we'll have to do it again.
Well, yeah, let's do it again sometime soon. Why don't you tell people some of the things that you're working on, including, I think you've got a Varga course coming up, don't you?
The Varga course, it was a weekend course, and that's already been completed. We did that a little while ago. It was a wonderful course. Basically, right now, all I'm working on is the apprenticeship program. It's a 4-year program. It starts at the very basics. If you go to astrovedicastrology.com and go to the Astrology Apprenticeship Program tab, and I've been in love with the idea for a long time, and I wasn't sure how it was going to go. but we just finished our first year. So year 1 begins again in February, and year 2, for the people who took the first year, will also begin in February. And I've got them writing papers, 2 1,500-word papers for each class. There's 3 classes. And we're starting with the Rashis, the houses, and the signs, and going into detail, not just the real simplistic, here's the idea of the signs, but for example, how do you use Rashi aspects with the signs? How do the signs actually create the Vargas? Because the Vargas are nothing different than slivers of a particular sign, right? So most of my time has really been invested in that. And I've got to say, I've worked them hard, and the students have really impressed me. So our new class begins in February. And if you're interested in looking that up, astrovedicastrology.com, the Astrology Apprenticeship Program. It has example classes, like there's about 3 one-hour classes that you can watch from the course. There's also, I think, 3 or 4 papers that students had written that I've posted on my website that you can see what kind of work are they doing and what are they learning. But that's where I'm spending most of my time at this point.
Excellent.
Along with clients. Yeah.
That's good for me to know too, because on my end, I get a lot of people who are wondering if I'm doing anything like that right now, and I'm actually not. So I know where to.
Yeah, send them over.
Somebody who is. Well, wonderful to have you on.
You too. You too.
And let's do this again sometime soon.
We will.
All right. Take care, everybody.
Okay.